The scene is eerily quiet except for the faint wailing of a baby from another room. The sun has long since set over the quiet suburb, but the flashing red and blue lights illuminate the pristine exterior of Amber Collins's home. Inside, officers step cautiously through the doorway, their boots crunching over shattered glass. In the middle of the living room, Amber Collins lies motionless in a pool of blood. Her once vibrant personality reduced to a haunting silence. Amber's house, typically immaculate, is in disarray. A toppled chair, scattered papers, and a photo frame shattered on the floor hint at a violent struggle. The detectives note every detail as they walk around the room, their eyes darting from one piece of evidence to another. Detective Matt Harris, a seasoned investigator known for his calm demeanor, kneels by Amber's body, examining the blood pattern. His partner, rookie officer Grace Harper, looks pale, barely concealing her shock. "Where's the weapon?" Harris mutters, scanning the room. "Not here," Harper replies, her voice trembling. She points to the shattered photo frame on the floor. It's a picture of her and someone else. Maybe a friend." Harris picks up the blood-smeared frame, examining the photo of Amber and another woman, smiling brightly as if they didn't have a care in the world. "What's the baby's name again?" Harris asks, breaking the tense silence. "Emma Walker." "The missing woman's child," Harper replies. "Amber was hosting her baby shower earlier today." The police quickly realize that the pregnant woman, Hannah Walker, hasn't been seen since the baby shower ended. Her car is gone, her phone is left behind, and no one knows where she is. As officers canvass the area, the neighbors begin to fill in details. Several heard shouting from Amber's house in the late afternoon. One neighbor swears she saw Hannah leave in tears shortly before the commotion ended. As officers search the scene, they find a piece of paper on the dining table. It's unsigned, but chillingly clear. "Lies always catch up to you." The narrative shifts, briefly flashing back to earlier in the day at the baby shower. Amber is seen fussing over the decorations, pouring drinks for the guests, and smiling as Hannah opens presents. In the quiet moments, away from the other guests, Amber's tone becomes sharp, her words laced with veiled accusations. "You should be thanking me for keeping your secret," she says. The tension between them is palpable, but it remains unclear what triggered the fatal turn of events later that day. The flashback fades back to the present as Detective Harris examines the clues. The shattered photo frame, smeared with blood, contains a picture of Amber and Hannah from happier times. The glass is broken, and the detectives speculate it may have been used as a weapon or thrown in anger. Despite the blood at the scene, no clear weapon is found. The absence raises immediate questions about whether Hannah took it with her or if someone else removed it before the police arrived. Harris carefully picks up the blooded frame and sets it aside for evidence. Grace Harper's voice breaks his train of thought. "Sir, there's something else." She holds up the note. Its bold, ominous words, "Lies always catch up to you," create a ripple of tension in the room. Harris studies it for a moment, his brows furrowing. Who wrote this, he wonders aloud. As the detectives piece together the initial evidence, the unanswered questions weigh heavily in the air. Did Hannah kill Amber in a fit of jealous rage? With her pregnancy, heightened emotions, and a potential love triangle, she seems like the obvious suspect. But is she? What is Jake Turner's role in all this? Jake, the man both women were connected to, is conspicuously absent from the scene. Neighbors mention his been spending time with Amber lately, adding fuel to the fire of suspicion. And then there's the note. Its cryptic message suggests this murder wasn't random. Was someone else pulling the strings, perhaps manipulating Hannah and Amber for their own gain? As the detectives secure the crime scene, the baby's cries grow louder. Grace Harper retrieves the infant from the nursery, her hands trembling as she lifts the baby into her arms. The child's innocent wails contrast with the grim reality unfolding in the living room. Who leaves a baby behind? Harper whispers, looking to Harris for reassurance. Harris, his face grim, doesn't answer. His mind races with possibilities as he glances. Again at the note, the broken frame, and the eerie stillness of the house. Finally, he turns to his team, his voice steady but firm. "Let's find Hannah Walker," he says. "And let's hope we're not already too late." The scene closes with Harris stepping outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. He gazes up at the darkened sky, his thoughts swirling with suspicion, doubt, and the unsettling certainty that this is only the beginning of a much darker mystery. Hannah Walker and Amber Collins were the kind of friends people envied. From the moment they met in elementary school in their small Midwest town of Evergreen, they were inseparable. Their bond seemed unshakable, the kind that made people say, "Those two will be friends forever." But forever is a long time, and even the strongest friendships can crack under the weight of betrayal. Amber was everything Hannah wasn't. Outgoing, confident, and effortlessly charismatic. She had a way of lighting up every room she walked into, her infectious laugh drawing people toward her like moths to a flame. People loved Amber, and she loved being loved. Hannah, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. She didn't crave attention the way Amber did. Instead, she found comfort in the shadows, content to let Amber shine. Together, they balanced each other perfectly. Amber pushed Hannah out of her comfort zone, while Hannah grounded Amber when her impulsive nature threatened to get the better of her. Growing up in Evergreen, where everyone knew everyone, the two girls were practically sisters. They shared secrets, dreams, and every major milestone of their lives. Amber often joked that they knew each other better than anyone else ever could. For years, this was true. But even the closest friendships have fault lines, and theirs was no exception. When Jake Turner came into their lives, those fault lines began to widen. Jake Turner moved to Evergreen 2 years ago. A contractor by trade, he was hired to renovate some of the aging homes in the area, quickly making a name for himself. With his talent and charm, Jake had rugged good looks, the kind that made women look twice, and an air of mystery that intrigued everyone he met. He was a fresh face in a town where not much ever changed, and it wasn't long before he became the subject of gossip. Amber noticed him first, of course. She had a knack for spotting a new challenge, and Jake seemed like the perfect one. She made no effort to hide her interest, openly flirting with him whenever the opportunity arose. She'd toss her hair, laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, and find excuses to be near him. Jake didn't seem to mind. He played along, his easygoing nature making him a favorite among the locals, Amber included. Hannah watched all of this from the sidelines. She was used to Amber being the center of attention and had never begrudged her for it. But something about Jake caught her attention in a way she couldn't quite explain. He wasn't just charming, he was kind, attentive, and seemed to notice things about people that others didn't. When he spoke to Hannah, it was different. He asked her questions about herself, really listened to her answers, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. It wasn't long before Hannah found herself looking forward to their conversations, though she told herself it was nothing more than friendly curiosity. At first, it was innocent enough. Jake would chat with Hannah when Amber wasn't around, and she didn't think much of it. But as time went on, their conversations grew longer and more personal. He made her laugh, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, it was the way he made her feel, like she was the only person in the room. Hannah tried to push her feelings aside, reminding herself that Amber liked him. But the more time she spent with Jake, the harder it became to ignore the connection between them. The turning point came one evening after a town event. Jake walked Hannah home, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his voice low and steady as they talked about everything and nothing. When they reached her porch, he hesitated for a moment. Before saying, "I don't think I've met anyone like you before." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Hannah didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him, to leave, to tell him this couldn't happen. But instead, she let herself fall. Their relationship began in secret. They met in private, stealing moments away from prying eyes. Hannah knew it was wrong, that she was betraying Amber in the worst way possible. But she couldn't stop. Jake made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt before, and she was too far gone to turn back. Things became even more complicated when Hannah discovered she was pregnant. The news was both terrifying and exhilarating. When she told Jake, his reaction surprised her. He seemed genuinely happy, even excited. He promised to be there for her and the baby, but there was one condition: no one could know about their relationship, at least not yet. "Amber would never forgive me," he said. "Let me handle this." Hannah agreed, though his words planted a seed of doubt in her mind. If he really cared for her, why was he so afraid of Amber finding out? Amber found out about the pregnancy soon after. Hannah never told her who the father was, and Amber didn't press her on it. At least, not at first. She seemed happy for Hannah, offering to help with baby clothes and nursery planning. But as the weeks went on, her behavior began to change. She became distant, her words laced with an edge that hadn't been there before. She started making cryptic comments, like, "Secrets have a way of coming out," and, "You're lucky I'm such a good friend." Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that Amber knew more than she was letting on. Her suspicions were confirmed one evening when she overheard Amber talking to Jake. She couldn't make out all the words, but the tone of their conversation made her blood run cold. Jake tried to downplay it when Hannah confronted him, saying Amber had only guessed the truth. But Hannah wasn't convinced. The trust between them, already fragile, began to crumble. Amber, meanwhile, seemed to enjoy the tension. She started spending more time with Jake, laughing at his jokes and touching his arm in ways that made Hannah's stomach twist. She made little digs at Hannah, subtle enough to pass as jokes but sharp enough to sting. Hannah began to feel like she was losing control of everything. Her relationship with Jake, her friendship with Amber, and her sense of self. Things came to a head one night at a dinner party. Amber, clearly drunk, made a toast that left the room in stunned silence. "To secrets," she said, raising her glass. "The ones we keep, and the ones that destroy us." Her eyes locked with Hannah's as she spoke, a smirk playing on her lips. Hannah left the party early, her heart pounding. She couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, it was all too much. The next day, Amber invited Hannah over for coffee. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. Hannah went, though every instinct told her not to. The conversation started off civil, but it quickly escalated. Amber accused Hannah of keeping secrets, of lying to her. When Hannah tried to defend herself, Amber laughed. "Do you really think Jake loves you?" she said. "He's been with me this whole time." The words hit Hannah like a slap. She felt the ground shift beneath her, her world crumbling around her. Amber didn't stop. "You're just a placeholder, Hannah. You'll never be enough for him." Hannah left Amber's house that day feeling like she was about to break. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, and there was no going back. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to come crashing down in a way none of them could have imagined. Hannah Walker had always known Amber Collins was the kind of person who attracted attention. Growing up in the small Midwest town of Evergreen, Amber had effortlessly commanded every room she walked into. Her confidence, her charm, her wit, it all made her unforgettable. People naturally gravitated toward her, and Hannah was no exception. They had been best friends since childhood, their bond forged in countless shared secrets and adventures. Amber had always been the brighter flame, while Hannah was the steady, dependable one who kept their dynamic grounded. But even the strongest bonds could falter under the weight of betrayal. Hannah didn't know what to make of the package she found on her doorstep that Tuesday afternoon. It was raining, the kind of persistent drizzle that made the whole world feel gray and muted. The package was unremarkable, a plain, brown envelope, with her name hastily scrawled across the front in uneven black ink. She stared at it. For a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about it felt wrong, but she couldn't explain why. She carried it inside, setting it carefully on the kitchen counter as though it might explode. For a moment, she debated leaving it unopened. But curiosity, and a growing sense of dread, won out. With trembling hands, she tore open the envelope, her breath catching as its contents spilled out. Amber's diary. Hannah froze, staring at the leather-bound book like it was a snake poised to strike. Amber's diary had always been off-limits, a sacred repository of her private thoughts. Amber had once joked that her diary was where she wrote all the things she couldn't say out loud, and Hannah had respected that boundary without question. Until now. She hesitated, torn between her loyalty to her friend and the burning need to know why Amber's most personal possession had been left anonymously on her doorstep. Finally, she opened the diary, her eyes scanning the familiar looping handwriting on the first page. And quote, "She doesn't know the whole truth. If she ever finds out, it'll destroy her." And quote. Hannah felt her stomach drop. The words were underlined, the ink pressed so hard it had bled through to the other side of the page. She flipped to another entry, her heart racing as she read. And quote, "Jake is a master manipulator. He acts like he cares about her, but I see right through him. He's good at lying, it's almost impressive. But she's too blind to see it." And quote, "Jake." Of course, it came back to Jake. Hannah slammed the diary shut, her mind racing. What was Amber talking about? What didn't she know? She couldn't shake the feeling that Amber had been keeping something from her, something that could change everything. She glanced back at the diary, its leather cover glistening faintly in the dim light. It felt like Pandora's box, something that once opened, could never be closed again. The next morning, a folded piece of paper was slipped under her door. It was weighted down by a small rock, as though the sender wanted to make sure it didn't blow away. Hannah picked it up with trembling hands, unfolding it to reveal a single chilling sentence. And quote, "You don't know who your real enemies are." And quote. The handwriting wasn't Amber's. It wasn't Jake's either. It was bold and deliberate, each letter written with unsettling precision. Her heart raced as she reread the note, its message echoing in her mind. Was Amber warning her? Or was someone else trying to manipulate her? Hannah felt like she was being pulled into a game she didn't understand, the rules shifting with every move. She wanted to confront Amber, to demand answers, but part of her was afraid of what she might uncover. Instead, she tried to distract herself, throwing herself into work and pretending everything was normal. But the diary and the notes sat on her nightstand like ghosts, haunting her every thought. It was 2 days later when she saw Jake's truck parked outside Amber's house. It was late, nearly midnight, and the sight of it made Hannah's heart sink. Jake had told her he was working late, but now it was clear he had lied. She parked her car down the street, cutting the engine and watching from a distance. Through the living room window, she could see Jake and Amber standing close together, their heads bent in conversation. The way Amber touched his arm, the way Jake leaned in toward her, it was too familiar, too intimate. Hannah felt a wave of anger and humiliation crash over her. She wanted to burst through the door and confront them, to demand the truth. But instead, she drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The next day, she confronted Jake, her voice trembling with rage. "Why were you at Amber's house last night?" Jake froze, his expression shifting from surprise to defensiveness. I wasn't. Don't lie to me. Hannah snapped, cutting him off. I saw your truck. I saw you with her. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. It's not what you think, he said. Finally. Amber needed help with something. That's all. Help with what? Hannah demanded, her eyes narrowing. Jake hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. It's complicated, he said at last, and Hannah felt her heart break a little more. It's always complicated with you, isn't it? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jake reached for her, but she pulled away. For the first time, she saw him clearly, not as the man she had fallen in love with, but as someone who had been lying to her. From the start. That evening, Hannah tried to confront Amber. She showed up at her house, unannounced, clutching the diary in one hand and the note in the other. Amber answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, leaning casually against the frame as though she had been expecting her. Well, this is a surprise, Amber said, her tone laced with sarcasm. We need to talk, Hannah said, stepping past her into the house. Amber didn't stop her. Instead, she followed her into the living room, where she poured herself a glass of wine and sat down on the couch. So, she said, crossing her legs. What's this about? Hannah held up the diary, her hands shaking. Why was this left on my doorstep? Amber's smile faltered, but only for a moment. I have no idea, she said, her voice light. But I'm flattered someone thought my private thoughts were worth sharing. Don't play games with me, Amber, Hannah snapped. I've read it. I know what you've been writing about Jake. About me. Amber's expression darkened, and for the first time, Hannah saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or anger. And Amber said, her voice colder now. What exactly do you think you know? Hannah hesitated, the words catching in her throat. You've been lying to me, she said finally. Both of you. I don't know how, but I know you have. Amber laughed, a bitter sound that sent chills down Hannah's spine. Oh, sweetie, she said, setting her wineglass down on the coffee table. You have no idea what you're talking about. Then tell me, Hannah demanded. Tell me the truth. Amber leaned back against the couch, her eyes glittering with something dark and dangerous. You wouldn't survive knowing the truth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with tension. Then, without another word, Hannah turned and walked out the door, her mind racing. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Amber's words replayed over and over in her mind. You wouldn't survive knowing the truth. What truth? What could Amber possibly mean? And who had sent the note? The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit, no matter how hard Hannah tried to make sense of them. All she knew was that the walls were closing in, and there was no way out. The secrets they had been keeping weren't just cracks in their relationships. They were fissures, ready to split wide open. And when they did, Hannah knew everything would come crashing down. She just didn't know how devastating the fallout would be. The day of the baby shower was one of those perfect autumn afternoons where the air seemed crisp and alive with the promise of change. Amber Collins had outdone herself, as always. Her backyard had been transformed into a pastel dream, with pink and white streamers swaying in the gentle breeze and floral centerpieces that looked like they belonged in a magazine. A dessert table stood as the centerpiece, overflowing with cupcakes, macarons, and a towering cake adorned with intricate, baby-themed decorations. Guests mingled under the canopy of string lights, sipping mimosas and exchanging compliments about Amber's impeccable taste. Hannah Walker, however, felt like an intruder in her own celebration. She smiled and nodded politely as friends and acquaintances congratulated her. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was in turmoil. The events of the past few weeks, the anonymous note, Amber's diary, Jake's lies, were like an undercurrent, pulling her deeper and deeper into a place she couldn't escape. She scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on Amber, who was in her element. Amber's laughter rang out like a melody, her bright smile drawing people toward her like moths to a flame. When Amber turned and caught Hannah's gaze, her expression shifted. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, something Hannah couldn't quite place. Then Amber smiled, wide and welcoming, and crossed the yard to greet her. "There's the woman of the hour," Amber exclaimed, throwing her arms around Hannah in an exaggerated hug. "Doesn't she look radiant, everyone?" The crowd murmured their agreement, and Hannah forced a smile, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. Amber's grip was a little too tight, her tone a little too sweet. "Thank you, Amber," Hannah said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Amber pulled back, her hands still resting on Hannah's shoulders. "You're welcome, sweetie," she said, her smile sharp. "Anything for my best friend." The words felt like a knife twisting in Hannah's chest. As the afternoon wore on, Amber's carefully curated hospitality began to show cracks. It started with small, seemingly innocuous comments. When a guest complimented Hannah on her glowing complexion, Amber laughed and said, "Well, pregnancy hormones can be tricky. Let's just hope she doesn't let them get the better of her." The guests chuckled politely, but Hannah's stomach churned. Later, during the gift-opening portion of the shower, Amber leaned in close, her voice low enough that only Hannah could hear. "You're really lucky, you know," she said, her tone laced with something Hannah couldn't identify. "Not everyone would be so understanding in your situation." Hannah turned to her, her brow furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Amber smiled, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Oh, nothing," she said airily. "We'll talk later." By the time the last guest had left, Hannah was exhausted. The weight of Amber's passive-aggressive remarks, combined with her own simmering anger and anxiety, left her feeling drained. She gathered her things, ready to leave and put the day behind her. But Amber wasn't done with her yet. "Wait," Amber said, her voice firm as she stepped in front of Hannah. "We need to talk." Hannah froze, her heart pounding. "Amber, I really don't." "Sit," Amber interrupted, gesturing to the couch in the living room. Reluctantly, Hannah obeyed, perching on the edge of the couch as Amber poured herself a glass of wine and settled into the armchair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Amber swirled the wine in her glass, her expression unreadable. "Do you know why I threw this shower for you?" Amber asked finally, breaking the silence. Hannah frowned. "Because you're my friend." Amber laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made Hannah's stomach tighten. "Oh, sweetie," she said, setting her glass on the coffee table. "You're so naive sometimes. I threw this shower because I felt sorry for you." Hannah blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about?" Amber leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with something dark. "Jake doesn't love you," she said, her voice low and cruel. "He's been with me this whole time." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. She stared at Amber, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. "That's not true," she said, her voice trembling. "Isn't it?" Amber said, raising an eyebrow. "Ask him about the nights he was working late. Or better yet, ask him about the weekend we spent at the lake house." Hannah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You're lying," she whispered. Amber smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent chills down Hannah's spine. "You've always been so easy to fool," she said. "Jake only stayed with you because he felt sorry for you. He doesn't want you. He never did." Something inside Hannah snapped. She stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. "You're a liar," she spat, her voice shaking with rage. Amber stood as well, her expression cold and unyielding. "Am I?" she said. "Or are you just too weak to face the truth?" Hannah couldn't take it anymore. She turned and stormed out of the house, slamming The door behind her. The cool evening air hit her like a slap, but it did little to calm her racing heart. She got into her car and drove, not caring where she was going. She ended up in an empty parking lot, sitting in her car with her hands gripping the steering wheel as tears streamed down her face. The anger she'd felt in Amber's living room hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, fueled by the humiliation and betrayal coursing through her veins. By the time she drove back to Amber's house, she was trembling with fury. She didn't know what she was going to say, but she knew she couldn't leave things the way they were. When she arrived, the house was dark except for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. Hannah parked down the street, her hands shaking as she stepped out of the car. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as she pushed it open. "Amber," she called, her voice echoing in the silence. There was no response. She walked into the living room, where the lamp cast long shadows across the walls. At first, she didn't see anything unusual. And then her eyes landed on the floor. Amber was lying there, her body sprawled unnaturally, her eyes wide and unseeing. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the plush carpet. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene. The shattered phone lying nearby, the blood-streaked picture of Jake on the coffee table, the broken vase shards scattered across the floor. Hannah stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as nausea threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't know what had happened, but one thing was clear: Amber was dead. Panic surged through her. She couldn't stay here. If someone found her, they would think she had done this. Her heart pounding, she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. Hours later, the police arrived after a neighbor reported hearing yelling followed by an eerie silence. The crime scene was chaotic, every detail pointing to a violent struggle. Detective Matt Harris stood in the living room, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "This wasn't random," he said, his voice grim. "This was personal." He picked up the blooded picture frame, his jaw tightening as he studied it. "Find out where Hannah Walker is," he added. "She's the key to all of this." But Hannah was nowhere to be found. Detective Matt Harris stepped into the quiet chaos of Amber Collins's living room. The house, once pristine and carefully decorated, was now a haunting reflection of the violence that had taken place. Blood pooled on the plush carpet where Amber's body had been found, and shards of a broken vase littered the floor. The crime scene told a story of chaos, of something deeply personal and uncontrollably explosive. Harris had worked plenty of homicide cases in his career, but this one felt different. There was something unnervingly intimate about it, something that hinted at a tangled web of relationships gone wrong. As he surveyed the room, his sharp eyes caught every detail: the shattered phone near the coffee table, the blooded frame of a photograph featuring Amber and a man, and the absence of a weapon. Whoever had done this hadn't been careful, but they'd left behind just enough mystery to make his job harder. Detective, Officer Grace Harper called from the doorway, holding a notepad. "We've got a statement from one of the neighbors," she said. She heard yelling earlier in the evening. A woman's voice, angry, followed by a loud crash. Then silence. Harris nodded, his mind already piecing together the first fragments of the puzzle. "And the time?" "Approximately 8:30 p.m., Harper replied. She said she saw a car parked down the street earlier, dark-colored, possibly a sedan. But she didn't get a good look at it." "Figures," Harris muttered. "Witnesses always saw just enough to tease the truth, but not enough to nail it down." He gestured toward the coffee table. "Bag the photo frame. And the phone. Let's see if there are any prints or messages. And find out if there's CCTV footage from the surrounding area." As the officers worked, Harris's gaze fell on the single sheet of paper resting on the dining table. The bold, neatly written words sent a chill through him. "Lies always catch up to you." He studied it for a long moment, his instincts buzzing. The note wasn't signed, but it felt deliberate, like someone wanted it to be found. Sir, Harper said, interrupting his thoughts. The victim's phone shows multiple missed calls from a Jake Turner. There's also a message from earlier in the day that says, "We need to talk." Harris's brow furrowed. Jake Turner? Who is he? Still looking into it, Harper replied. But several neighbors mentioned seeing him around the house a lot. Apparently, he and Amber were close. Harris made a mental note. The name Jake Turner had just jumped to the top of his list. By the next morning, Harris had learned plenty about Amber Collins and her tangled relationships. Interviews with neighbors painted a picture of a woman who had recently become paranoid and distant. She had confided in one neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Linda, about feeling watched and worrying that someone was out to get her. Linda had shrugged it off at the time, thinking Amber was being dramatic, but now she wasn't so sure. "She told me she had secrets," Linda said during her interview. "But I didn't ask. Amber was always a little, dramatic. I thought she was just looking for attention." "What kind of secrets?" Harris pressed. Linda shook her head. She didn't say. Just that they were big enough to ruin everything if they came out. Harris scribbled in his notebook, his thoughts racing. Secrets. The unsigned note. The suspicious messages from Jake Turner. It was becoming clear that Amber's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was the result of something far more calculated. When Amber's diary was uncovered later that day, it only deepened the mystery. The entries revealed a woman who was spiraling, her thoughts consumed by betrayal and distrust. She had written extensively about Jake and Hannah, detailing her suspicions about their relationship and hinting at her own involvement with Jake. And quote, "I know what they're hiding," and quote. One entry read, and quote, "Jake thinks he's so clever, but I've got him figured out. And Hannah, she's not as innocent as she pretends to be." And quote. Another entry was even more chilling, and quote, "If this gets out, it'll destroy all of us. But maybe it needs to." And quote. Harris read the diary cover to cover, piecing together the fractured relationships and mounting tension that had ultimately led to Amber's death. But one question lingered in his mind. Who had finally snapped? Hannah Walker's disappearance complicated things further. Her car had been found abandoned on the side of a rural road, its engine cold and the driver's seat empty. For 48 hours, she was nowhere to be found, and speculation ran wild. Some believed she had fled after killing Amber in a fit of rage. Others thought she might be a victim herself, taken by whoever had killed her best friend. When Hannah finally resurfaced at a motel 2 towns over, she was disoriented and visibly shaken. Harris was notified immediately and drove out to question her. He found her sitting on the edge of the motel bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap and her eyes red from crying. "Hannah Walker," he said, stepping into the room. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Are you here to arrest me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That depends," Harris said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from her. "Why? Don't you tell me what happened?" Hannah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't kill her," she said finally. "I swear I didn't." Harris studied her carefully, noting the tremble in her hands and the haunted look in her eyes. "Then tell me what you remember." She took a deep breath, her words coming slowly at first. She described the baby shower, the tension with Amber, and their argument later that evening. But when it came to the hours after she had left Amber's house, her memory became hazy. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I was so angry. I drove around for a while, and then, I don't remember. I just ended up here." "You don't remember anything after you left the house?" Harris pressed. Hannah shook her head again. "No. But I didn't kill her. I couldn't," she trailed off, her voice breaking. Harris let the silence linger for a moment before asking, "Did Amber ever threaten you?" Hannah hesitated, her brow furrowing. She said some things, she admitted. She told me Jake wasn't who I thought he was. That he was using me. She said she had proof, and that if I didn't back off, she'd expose him. Expose him for what? Harris asked, leaning forward. I don't know, Hannah said, her voice trembling. She didn't tell me, but she made it sound serious. Harris's mind raced. Amber's diary had hinted at secrets, and now Hannah was confirming them. Whatever Jake Turner had been hiding, it was enough to make Amber feel threatened, and enough to push someone to murder. Jake Turner was brought in for questioning later that day. Harris watched him carefully as he sat across the interrogation table, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Jake was handsome in a rugged way, with the kind of charm that could disarm most people. But Harris wasn't most people. Let's start with the basics, Harris said, his tone calm but firm. What was your relationship with Amber Collins? Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. We were friends, he said. That's all. Friends. Harris repeated, raising an eyebrow. Because according to multiple witnesses, and Amber's own diary, you were a lot more than that. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Let me make this easy for you, Harris continued. You were at Amber's house the night she died. A neighbor saw your truck parked outside. Care to explain? Jake hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. I stopped by, he admitted. We had a lot to talk about. What kind of things? Harris asked. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, his discomfort evident. Amber was upset, he said. Finally. She had this idea in her head that I was trying to screw her over. She wouldn't listen to reason. Was she right? Harris asked, his tone sharp. No. Jake snapped, his voice rising. I wasn't doing anything to her. She was paranoid. And what about Hannah? Harris pressed. What's your relationship with her? Jake hesitated again, his silence speaking volumes. Harris leaned forward, his gaze steady. I think you've been playing both sides, he said. And I think Amber finally called you on it. Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't respond. Harris let the silence linger, watching as the cracks in Jake's composure began to show. You're hiding something, Harris said finally. And I'm going to find out what it is. As Jake was escorted back to his holding cell, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just within reach. Amber's death wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the result of secrets, lies, and a tangled web of betrayal. And Harris was determined to untangle it. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Hannah Walker sat at the defense table, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. The trial of the decade, as the media had dubbed it, had drawn a full audience, journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and local townsfolk eager to witness the spectacle. Cameras were banned from the courtroom, but that hadn't stopped reporters from lining the courthouse steps every morning, eager to capture the faces of the key players in what had become a national story. Hannah felt the weight of every eye on her, their judgment palpable even though no verdict had been reached. She avoided looking at the gallery, keeping her gaze fixed on the polished wood of the defense table. Her attorney, Laura Price, sat beside her, flipping through a stack of papers and murmuring reassurances. It's going to be fine, Laura said, her tone calm but firm. Just remember to stay composed. The prosecution's going to come out swinging, but we've got a solid defense. Hannah nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. The truth was, she couldn't remember enough of that night to defend herself. All she had were fragmented memories and an overwhelming sense of dread. The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of Hannah as a jealous, emotionally unstable woman who had snapped in a fit of rage. In his opening statement, the prosecutor, Mark Davis, laid out a narrative that was both compelling and devastating. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Davis began, pacing in front of the jury box. This case is about jealousy. It's about betrayal. And it's about a woman who couldn't handle the idea of losing control. He gestured toward Hannah, his tone growing sharper. The evidence will show that. Hannah Walker had every reason to hate Amber Collins. She was jealous of her, suspicious of her relationship with Jake Turner, and consumed by anger. On the night of October 15th, that anger reached its breaking point. In a premeditated act of violence, she went to Amber's house and killed her. Hannah felt her heart sink as Davis outlined the prosecution's case. He described the argument between her and Amber at the baby shower, the yelling heard by neighbors, and the evidence found at the scene, a blood-streaked picture of Jake, Amber's shattered phone, and the absence of a murder weapon, which Davis argued Hannah had taken with her when she fled. When Laura stood to deliver her opening statement, her tone was measured but resolute. She painted a very different picture of Hannah, one of a woman who had been manipulated and betrayed by the people she trusted most. Hannah Walker is not a killer, Laura began, her voice steady. She is a victim. A victim of lies, manipulation, and the toxic dynamics of those around her. The prosecution would have you believe that this is a simple case of jealousy, but the truth is far more complicated. Laura went on to describe how Amber had taunted Hannah, revealing her affair with Jake and threatening to expose him for his alleged crimes. She argued that Hannah had been emotionally distressed and vulnerable, not capable of the calculated murder. The prosecution claimed. Over the course of the trial, witnesses were called to testify, each adding a new layer to the tangled web of relationships that had led to Amber's death. Neighbors recounted hearing yelling from Amber's house the night she died. One neighbor testified to seeing Hannah leave the house earlier in the evening, her face red and her movements agitated. Another claimed to have seen Jake's truck parked outside the house later that night, though Jake denied being there during that time. Jake Turner himself was called to the stand, his testimony a critical moment in the trial. He walked to the witness box with a confidence that made Hannah's stomach churn. Dressed in a suit and tie, he looked every bit the charming contractor who had fooled them all. Under questioning from the prosecution, Jake admitted to having a relationship with both Amber and Hannah, though he downplayed the seriousness of his involvement with Amber. Amber and I were close, he said, his tone carefully neutral. But it wasn't anything serious. She had a way of blowing things out of proportion. When asked about the note found at the scene, Jake claimed to know nothing about it, though Davis hinted that it might have been left by Hannah as part of her plan to mislead investigators. Laura's cross-examination, however, revealed cracks in Jake's story. She pressed him on his timeline for the night of the murder, pointing out inconsistencies in his statements to police. Jake grew defensive, his polished demeanor slipping as Laura questioned him about his financial dealings with Amber. Isn't it true, Laura asked, that Amber had threatened to expose your illegal activities if you didn't leave her alone? Jake's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. But Laura persisted, introducing evidence of fraudulent contracts Jake had filed in Amber's name. Emails between the two revealed that Amber had discovered his schemes and was planning to report him to the authorities. Amber had leverage over you, Laura said, her voice sharp. And you had every reason to want her out of the way. Jake's silence spoke volumes. The trial took a dramatic turn when a handwriting expert was called to testify about the anonymous notes found at Amber's house. The expert revealed that the handwriting on the notes did not match Amber's, as the prosecution had initially implied. Instead, the handwriting bore striking similarities to Jake's. This is where it all falls apart, Laura whispered to Hannah as the expert presented their findings. They built their entire case on those notes. The revelation stunned the courtroom. Jake had been playing both women against each other, planting the notes to stoke their paranoia and keep them distracted while he carried out his schemes. His motive became clear. He had planned to steal money from Amber and leave town, but her discovery of his plans had thrown everything into chaos. But the trial wasn't over yet. Another bombshell was about to drop. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution introduced a new witness, Logan Collins, Amber's estranged older brother. Logan was a man with a troubled past, gambling debts, a string of failed jobs, and a reputation for being unreliable. He had been absent from Amber's life for years, only resurfacing after her death. Logan's demeanor was nervous as he took the stand, his eyes darting around the courtroom. Under questioning, he claimed to have visited Amber the night of her murder to ask for money. When she refused, he admitted. They argued. But he denied having anything to do with her death. "I left," Logan insisted, his voice shaking. "She was alive when I left." But Harris, who had been investigating Logan on the side, presented evidence that suggested otherwise. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed Logan purchasing gloves and a hammer just hours before Amber's death. Forensic analysis revealed that the blood on Logan's clothing matched Amber's. As the courtroom erupted in whispers, Logan broke down, confessing to the crime. He claimed it hadn't been planned, that he had acted in a fit of rage after Amber refused to help him pay off his gambling debts. In a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, he had planted evidence to frame Hannah, knowing her emotional state would make her an easy target. The confession was a gut punch, leaving everyone in the courtroom reeling. For Hannah, it was both a relief and a new kind of heartbreak. She was innocent, but the betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined. Amber's death hadn't been about jealousy or betrayal between friends. It had been about greed, desperation, and the dark secrets that had festered in Amber's life. When the verdict was finally read, Hannah felt a wave of emotion crash over her. She was acquitted of all charges, but the relief was bittersweet. She left the courthouse that day a free woman, but the scars of the trial, and the events that had led to it, would stay with her forever. The courtroom had been stifling that day, even as the jury delivered their verdict, not guilty. Hannah Walker felt a chill creep up her spine. Relief coursed through her veins, but it was fleeting. The cameras flashed, reporters whispered among themselves, and onlookers murmured in hushed tones. Justice had been served, but the weight of it all was still crushing. Hannah stood on the courthouse steps, her attorney Laura Price at her side, shielding her from the barrage of reporters desperate for a headline. Voices rose over one another, their questions piercing through the fog in Hannah's mind. Do you feel justice was served? How do you plan to rebuild your life? Do you think Amber's death will haunt you forever? That last question made her freeze for a moment. Amber's death would haunt her forever, that much was certain. Her best friend's murder wasn't something that could be erased, not by the verdict, not by time. She turned away from the reporters and climbed into Laura's waiting car. As the city streets blurred past her window, she pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the faint flutter of her unborn child. Emma, she thought. Her name will be Emma. Hannah moved to a small, unassuming town a month after the trial. Evergreen held nothing for her anymore. The house she had once shared with her best memories of Amber now felt tainted. Every corner of that town carried whispers and judgment, and no amount of time could change that. Her new apartment was modest, a quiet place tucked away on a sleepy street. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She told herself she'd start fresh here, focusing on the baby, and leaving the horrors of the past behind. For a while, it almost worked. During the day, Hannah threw herself into preparing for motherhood. She spent hours arranging Emma's crib, folding tiny clothes, and reading parenting books. Each kick and flutter reminded her that she was creating a new life, one that deserved peace and love. But at night, the past clawed its way back into her thoughts. The nightmares started just weeks after the move. At first, they were fragmented. Disjointed dreams of Amber's house, the blood-stained floor, and Amber's lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. But soon, the dreams became more vivid. In one, Amber stood at the foot of her bed, her mouth moving as if to speak, though no sound came out. In another, Amber's diary sat open on the coffee table, its pages flipping on their own, the words, "You'll never escape the truth," scrawled across every page. Hannah would wake in a cold sweat, clutching her belly as if to shield Emma from the lingering dread. She tried to convince herself it was just her guilt playing tricks on her, that her mind needed time to heal. But the dreams didn't stop. Meanwhile, Jake Turner's downfall had been swift and merciless. After Logan Collins confessed to Amber's murder, the authorities shifted their focus to Jake. Evidence of his fraudulent schemes surfaced: fake contracts, forged documents, and accounts used to funnel stolen money. Amber had discovered his crimes shortly before her death, and her threats to expose him had put him in a dangerous position. Jake, who had once charmed everyone in Evergreen with his easygoing demeanor and good looks, now found himself at the center of a media storm. His crimes, combined with his manipulative involvement in the toxic dynamic between Amber and Hannah, turned public opinion against him. By the time he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and conspiracy, he was a broken man. His reputation was in tatters, and no one in town mourned his downfall. For Hannah, Jake's punishment was cold comfort. Knowing he was behind bars didn't erase the pain he'd caused or the damage he'd done. She told herself that his absence was a step toward healing, but the scars he left on her life were deeper than she cared to admit. Hannah's daughter, Emma, was born on a clear spring morning. Holding her for the first time, Hannah felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: joy, relief, and a flicker of hope. Emma was perfect, with tiny fingers that curled around Hannah's thumb and bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in the world. For the first time in months, Hannah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could move forward. But even Emma's presence couldn't fully banish the shadows. Hannah often found herself staring out the window of her apartment late at night, her mind drifting back to Amber's house, the trial, and the note left at the scene. "Lies always catch up to you." The phrase haunted her, an echo of the events she could never truly escape. The first sign that the past wasn't done with her came one quiet evening as Hannah rocked Emma to sleep. She noticed something unusual tucked into the folds of the baby's blanket, a small, folded piece of paper. At first, she thought it was a receipt or a tag she'd missed, but when she unfolded it, her breath caught. And quote, "You'll never escape the past." And quote. The words were handwritten in bold, deliberate strokes. The handwriting didn't match Jake's, nor did it resemble Amber's. It was unfamiliar, yet chillingly intentional. Hannah's hands shook as she reread the note, her heart racing. How had it gotten there? Who had left it? She checked the locks on the doors and windows, but they were all secure. Still, the note was undeniable proof that someone had been in her home. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it must have been left by someone playing a cruel prank, maybe someone who had followed the trial. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The note felt personal, like a message meant specifically for her. As the weeks passed, Hannah began to feel the weight of something watching her. It started with small things, glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, the faint sound of floorboards creaking at night, and the sensation of being followed when she walked through the park with Emma. She told herself it was paranoia, her mind playing tricks on her. But the feeling persisted.